Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other nurses at St. Mary's Hospital. While her colleagues chatted about weekend plans and celebrity gossip during their breaks, she preferred to sit quietly in the corner, reading medical journals or simply observing the world around her. Her olive skin bore the marks of a life lived with purpose, but it was the intricate tattoo on her left forearm that drew the most attention and whispered comment from those who worked alongside her. The tattoo wasn't like the butterfly wings or inspirational quotes that adorned many of her peers. It was a complex military insignia, rendered in precise black ink with gold highlights that caught the light when she moved. Most people assumed it was just another decorative piece, perhaps chosen from a catalog at some downtown tattoo parlor. They had no idea of the weight it carried, the sacrifice it represented, or the story it told. Sarah had grown accustomed to the stares and whispered comments. During her 3 years at St. Mary's, she had heard it all. "Look at that fake military tattoo," some would say. "Probably thinks it makes her look tough," others would whisper. The worst comments came from those who assumed she was trying to attract attention or appear more interesting than she actually was. These words stung more than she let on. But Sarah had learned to keep her emotions carefully controlled. The truth was far more complex than her colleagues could imagine. Sarah had not always been a nurse in the quiet suburbs of Denver. Before she had dedicated her life to healing others, she had served her country in ways that most people could never comprehend. The insignia on her arm was not a fashion statement or an attempt to appear tough. It was a badge of honor, earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifices that had cost her more than she could ever fully explain to another person. Her journey had begun 8 years earlier when she was barely 20 years old. Fresh out of high school with few prospects and a family that struggled to make ends meet, Sarah had walked into the military recruitment office with determination burning in her eyes. She wanted to serve, to make a difference, to prove that she was capable of something greater than the limitations that others had placed on her. The path had not been easy. Basic training had pushed her to her physical and mental limits, but Sarah had emerged stronger than ever. Her natural intelligence and unwavering dedication had caught the attention of her superiors, who recommended her for specialized training. What followed were months of grueling preparation that tested every aspect of her character. Sarah had been selected for a Special Operations Support Unit, working directly with Navy SEALs on classified missions that took her to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Her role as a combat medic meant that she was responsible for keeping these elite warriors alive when everything went wrong. She had crawled through mud and sand under enemy fire, performed emergency surgery in makeshift field hospitals, and saved lives that would have been lost without her skills and courage. The insignia on her arm represented the unit she had served with for 4 years. It was not something that could be purchased or replicated. It was earned through demonstrated valor under fire, through countless hours of training, and through the trust of men who depended on her to bring them home alive. Only a select few wore this particular insignia, and each one had stories that would never be told in polite conversation. But Sarah's military career had ended abruptly and painfully. During her final deployment, an improvised explosive device had torn through their convoy, killing 3 of her teammates and leaving her with injuries that would change the course of her life forever. The physical wounds had healed, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. She had been awarded a Purple Heart and other commendations for her service, but the medals sat in a box in her closet, too painful to display. When she returned home, Sarah had struggled to find her place in a world that seemed foreign after years of life and death decisions. The transition from military service to civilian life was harder than she had anticipated. The skills that had made her invaluable on the battlefield seemed less relevant in everyday situations. She felt lost, disconnected from the people around her who had never experienced the intensity of combat or the brotherhood that came from shared danger. Nursing had been her way back to a life of purpose. The hospital environment, with its constant urgency and life-or-death decisions, felt familiar in a way that other civilian jobs could not. She could use her medical training to help people, and the fast-paced nature of emergency medicine reminded her of the field hospitals where she had first discovered her calling. However, Sarah had made the conscious decision not to discuss her military background with her colleagues. She had learned that people often reacted strangely when they discovered her past. Some became uncomfortable, unsure how to interact with someone who had seen combat. Others bombarded her with questions that she was not prepared or willing to answer. A few had even expressed doubt about her stories, suggesting that someone who looked like her could not possibly have served in such dangerous situations. So, she had chosen silence. She did her job with quiet competence, earning respect through her actions rather than her words. Her colleagues knew her as a skilled nurse who could handle any emergency with calm professionalism. They had no idea that the woman who worked beside them had once performed emergency amputations under fire, or that she had carried wounded soldiers to safety while bullets flew overhead. The comments about her tattoo continued, but Sarah had learned to tune them out. She focused on her patients and her work, finding satisfaction in the small victories that came with each life saved or each moment of comfort provided to someone in pain. The hospital had become her new mission, and she approached it with the same dedication that had once made her invaluable to her military unit. On this particular Tuesday morning, Sarah was beginning what she expected to be another routine shift. She had arrived early, as was her habit, and was reviewing patient charts when she heard the familiar whispers starting behind her. Two of the newer nurses were discussing her tattoo, making the same assumptions and jokes that she had heard countless times before. "I wonder where she got that fake military thing done," one of them said with a giggle. "Do you think she actually believes it make her look like some kind of soldier?" The other nurse joined in the speculation. "Maybe she's trying to impress Dr. Williams. You know how some guys are attracted to that whole tough girl thing?" Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she did not turn around. She had heard worse, and she had long ago decided that defending herself was not worth the energy. These people could never understand what she had been through, and she had no desire to educate them. Her tattoo meant something to her that went far beyond their petty comments and shallow judgments. As the morning progressed, Sarah threw herself into her work with typical intensity. She checked on her assigned patients, administered medications, and coordinated with doctors about treatment plans. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, reflecting the military training that still influenced every aspect of her professional life. Around 10 o'clock, the emergency department received word that they were about to receive several trauma patients from a serious automobile accident. Sarah immediately shifted into the mode that had once served her so well in combat situations. She helped prepare the trauma bay, gathered necessary supplies, and mentally prepared herself for whatever challenges the next few hours might bring. The first patient to arrive was a middle-aged man with severe chest injuries. Sarah worked alongside Dr. Williams to stabilize him, her hands moving with practiced precision as she started IVs and monitored vital signs. The second patient was a young woman with multiple fractures, requiring immediate surgery to save her life. As Sarah was transferring the young woman to the operating room, she noticed a commotion near the emergency department entrance. A group of men in military dress uniforms had arrived, and they appeared to be asking questions about the accident victims. She assumed they were there for some official purpose and continued with her duties. It was not until later that afternoon, during a brief break between patients, that Sarah encountered the military visitors directly. She was heading to the break room when she passed a group of Navy personnel speaking with the hospital administrator. As she walked by, keeping her head down and mind focused on her own business, she heard one of the men call out behind her, "Excuse me, nurse." Sarah turned around, surprised to be addressed by the military personnel. The man who had spoken was clearly a senior officer with ribbons and insignia that indicated significant experience and high rank. He was studying her with an intensity that made her somewhat uncomfortable. "Yes, sir," she responded automatically, falling back on the military courtesy that had been ingrained in her during her years of service. The officer's eyes had focused on her left forearm, where her tattoo was partially visible below her scrub sleeve. His expression changed dramatically as he recognized what he was seeing. The casual interest was replaced by something much more serious, almost shocked. "Could you roll up your sleeve, please?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure of what was happening or why this stranger was making such a request. However, years of military conditioning made it difficult to refuse a direct order from a superior officer, even in civilian circumstances. Slowly, she rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the complete insignia in all its detailed glory. The officer's reaction was immediate and intense. He stepped closer, studying the tattoo with the eye of someone who clearly recognized its significance. The other military personnel had also gathered around, their expressions shifting from casual interest to something approaching awe. "Where did you get this?" the senior officer asked, his voice now carrying a note of respect that had not been there moments before. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized that her carefully guarded secret was about to be exposed. These men clearly knew what her tattoo represented, and there would be no easy way to deflect their questions or maintain her privacy. "I served with the unit," she said quietly, meeting the officer's eyes with the steady gaze that had once been second nature to her. The effect of her words was electric. The senior officer straightened slightly, and Sarah noticed that the other personnel had fallen silent, listening intently to every word of the conversation. "What was your name during service?" he asked, and Sarah could hear the weight of authority in his voice. "Sergeant Sarah Martinez, 3rd Special Operations Support Unit," she replied, automatically providing the formal identification that had once been as natural as breathing. The senior officer's demeanor changed completely. The casual questioning was replaced by something much more formal and respectful. Sarah realized that he was beginning to understand exactly who she was and what she had accomplished during her military career. Around them, the hospital continued its normal operations, but Sarah felt as though she had been transported back to a world she had tried to leave behind. The familiar protocol, the military bearing of the men around her, and the recognition in their eyes all combined to bring memories flooding back with surprising intensity. She was no longer just Sarah the nurse, the quiet woman who endured whispered comments about her tattoo. In this moment, she was once again Sergeant Martinez, combat medic, decorated veteran, and member of an elite unit that had served with distinction in some of the world's most dangerous places. The conversation was just beginning, but Sarah already knew that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to change dramatically. The secret she had kept for so long was about to be revealed, and there would be no going back to the anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. Commander James Richardson of the United States Navy SEALs stood in the hospital corridor, his weathered face reflecting years of missions that had taken him to every corner of the world. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had led elite warriors through impossible situations and brought them home alive. His chest bore rows of ribbons that told stories of valor, sacrifice, and dedication to duty that few civilians could comprehend. The commander had come to St. Mary's Hospital on what he had expected to be a routine visit. One of his former team members, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, had been critically injured in the automobile accident that morning. Torres was now fighting for his life in the intensive care unit, and Richardson had come to ensure that everything possible was being done for a man who had served with distinction for over a decade. What he had not expected was to encounter Sergeant Sarah Martinez in the hallway of a civilian hospital, wearing scrubs instead of combat gear. As he studied the insignia on her arm, memories came flooding back with startling clarity. He remembered the young medic who had saved his life during a mission in Afghanistan 4 years earlier, when an enemy sniper had put a bullet through his shoulder and she had kept him conscious and stable during a harrowing helicopter evacuation under fire. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, and his voice carried a warmth that surprised even him. "You saved my life in Helmand Province. Operation Desert Storm, August 2021. Sarah's composure, which had remained steady throughout the initial questioning, finally began to crack. She remembered that mission with painful clarity. It had been one of the worst firefights of her deployment, with casualties mounting and enemy forces closing in from all directions. Commander Richardson had been leading a rescue operation when the sniper's bullet had found its mark, and Sarah had spent the next 6 hours keeping him alive while they waited for extraction. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, the memories threatening to overwhelm her carefully constructed emotional barriers. "I remember." The other military personnel who had gathered around were listening intently, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something significant. Word was spreading through the hospital that something unusual was happening near the emergency department, and a small crowd of staff members had begun to form at a respectful distance. Commander Richardson noticed the gathering crowd and realized that this conversation was becoming more public than either he or Sarah might have preferred. However, he also recognized that this was an opportunity to address something that clearly needed to be addressed. He had overheard enough of the whispered comments about Sarah's tattoo during his time in the hospital to understand what she had been enduring. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, his voice now carrying the formal authority of his rank. "Would you mind if I ask how long you've been working here?" 3 years, sir, Sarah replied, falling back into the military courtesy that had once been second nature to her. And during that time, have people questioned the authenticity of your unit insignia? Sarah hesitated, unsure of where this line of questioning was leading. She glanced around at the growing crowd of her colleagues, many of whom were the same people who had made jokes about her tattoo just hours earlier. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. Sometimes, sir, she answered honestly. Commander Richardson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his world, questioning the service record of a decorated veteran was not just disrespectful, it was unthinkable. The insignia that Sarah wore had been earned through sacrifice and courage that few people could imagine, and the fact that anyone would mock it represented everything that frustrated him about the disconnect between military and civilian cultures. I see, he said, his voice taking on a tone that every military person present immediately recognized as dangerous. And I assume that these people have no understanding of what that insignia represents or how it is earned. Sarah's discomfort was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent 3 years trying to avoid. She had built her civilian life on the foundation of quiet competence, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves rather than relying on her military credentials. Sir, with respect, I don't think this is necessary, she said, hoping to deflect the conversation before it went any further. But Commander Richardson was not finished. He had served in the military for over 25 years, and he had seen too many good soldiers struggle with the transition to civilian life. He had watched decorated heroes work menial jobs because their skills were not understood or appreciated by people who had never faced the challenges they had overcome. Actually, Sergeant, I think it is very necessary, he replied. May I ask why you chose not to discuss your service record with your colleagues here? The question hit closer to home than Sarah was comfortable with. The truth was complicated and painful, involving experiences that she was not ready to share with people who could not possibly understand them. Her silence during the past 3 years had been self-preservation, a way to avoid the questions and assumptions that inevitably came when people learned about her military background. I prefer to keep my personal life private, sir, she said, hoping that her response would satisfy him and bring this uncomfortable conversation to a close. Commander Richardson studied her for a long moment, and Sarah could see in his eyes the understanding that came from someone who had faced similar challenges. He recognized the signs of someone who was carrying burdens that others could not see, and his expression softened slightly. I understand the desire for privacy, Sergeant, he said, but I also believe that some things should not remain hidden, especially when ignorance leads to disrespect. The crowd of hospital staff had grown larger, and Sarah noticed that several of the nurses who had made comments about her tattoo earlier that day were now listening intently to every word of the conversation. She felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that she had not experienced since her early days of civilian life. Dr. Williams, who had worked closely with Sarah for over 2 years, pushed through the crowd with a confused expression on his face. He had heard rumors that something significant was happening in the corridor, but he had no idea what it might involve. Sarah, is everything all right? He asked, his concern evident in his voice. Commander Richardson turned to address the doctor, his military bearing immediately apparent to everyone present. Doctor, I'm Commander Richardson, United States Navy SEALs. I believe you work with Sergeant Martinez here. Dr. Williams looked puzzled. Sergeant? Sarah's a nurse. I'm not sure what you're talking about. The confusion in the doctor's voice was exactly what Commander Richardson had expected. He had encountered this situation many times before, where decorated veterans were working in civilian jobs, and their colleagues had no idea of their military background or achievements. Doctor, the woman you know as Sarah the nurse, is actually Sergeant Sarah Martinez, who served with distinction in Special Operations Support for over 4 years. She was awarded the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Combat Medical Badge for her service in Afghanistan and other classified locations. The effect of this revelation was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Williams's expression changed from confusion to amazement, and Sarah could see him processing this information and trying to reconcile it with the quiet, competent nurse he had worked with for so long. Sarah, is this true? He asked, turning to her with a look of disbelief. Sarah felt cornered and exposed. The careful barriers she had constructed around her past were crumbling, and there was no way to stop the avalanche of revelations that was about to follow. She nodded slowly, unable to find words that would adequately explain the complexity of her situation. Commander Richardson was not finished. He had recognized an opportunity to educate these civilians about the reality of military service and the sacrifice that it represented. More importantly, he wanted to ensure that Sarah received the respect that her service record demanded. The insignia on Sergeant Martinez's arm is not something that can be purchased or replicated, he continued, his voice carrying to every person in the growing crowd. It represents membership in one of the most elite medical units in the United States military. Only personnel who have demonstrated exceptional courage under fire and saved lives in combat situations are authorized to wear it. Sarah's colleagues were now looking at her with expressions that ranged from amazement to embarrassment. Several of the nurses who had made jokes about her tattoo were clearly uncomfortable, beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Furthermore, Commander Richardson continued, Sergeant Martinez personally saved my life during combat operations. She kept me alive for 6 hours under enemy fire while we waited for evacuation. Without her skill and courage, I would not be standing here today. The revelation was having exactly the impact that the commander had intended. The whispered conversations had stopped, replaced by a respectful silence, as people began to understand who Sarah really was and what she had accomplished. Dr. Williams was staring at Sarah with a new understanding in his eyes. Suddenly, her calm under pressure, her exceptional medical skills, and her ability to handle any emergency made perfect sense. He was beginning to realize that he had been working alongside someone whose experience far exceeded anything he had encountered in civilian medicine. Sarah, he said quietly, why didn't you ever tell us? It was the question that Sarah had been dreading, and one that she was not sure how to answer. The truth involved experiences that were too painful to discuss casually, decisions that had cost lives, and memories that still woke her up in the middle of the night. Her military service had been the defining experience of her adult life, but it was also the source of trauma that she was still learning to process. It's complicated, Dr. Williams, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Commander Richardson recognized the signs of someone who was struggling with emotions that were threatening to overwhelm her. He had seen the same expression on the faces of many veterans who were dealing with the invisible wounds that came with combat experience. Doctor, he said, addressing Dr. Williams directly, I hope you understand that Sergeant Martinez has served her country with extraordinary distinction. The fact that she chooses to continue serving others in a civilian capacity speaks to her character and dedication. Dr. Williams nodded, clearly still processing the information he had received. Of course, Commander. Sarah is one of our finest nurses. I had no idea about her military background, but it explains a lot about her exceptional abilities. The conversation was beginning to wind down, but Sarah knew that her life at St. Mary's Hospital would never be the same. The secret that she had guarded so carefully for 3 years had been revealed in the most public way possible, and she would now have to deal with the consequences of that exposure. As if reading her thoughts, Commander Richardson placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sergeant, I hope you don't regret this conversation. Your service deserves to be honored, not hidden. Sarah looked around at the faces of her colleagues, trying to read their expressions and understand how this revelation would change their relationships. Some looked impressed, others seemed embarrassed by their previous comments, and a few appeared to be struggling to reconcile the quiet nurse they knew with the combat veteran they had just learned about. Sir, she said, finding her voice again, I appreciate your intentions, but I chose not to discuss my military service for reasons that are important to me. Commander Richardson nodded understandingly. I respect that, Sergeant, but I also believe that ignorance should not be allowed to flourish when it leads to disrespect. Your service and sacrifices deserve better than that. The crowd was beginning to disperse, with people returning to their duties, but clearly carrying the weight of what they had just learned. Sarah knew that the whispered conversations would continue, but now they would be about her military service rather than assumptions about her tattoo. Dr. Williams lingered after the others had left, clearly wanting to continue the conversation with Sarah privately. Commander Richardson recognized the signal and prepared to take his leave. Sergeant Martinez, he said formally, extending his hand for a handshake. It has been an honor to see you again. Thank you for your continued service to others. Sarah shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who understood the weight of duty and sacrifice. Thank you, sir. I hope Staff Sergeant Torres recovers fully. As Commander Richardson walked away, Sarah was left alone with Dr. Williams, and the realization that her carefully constructed civilian life had just been permanently altered. The secret was out, and there would be no going back to the anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. Dr. Williams stood in the now-quiet corridor, his mind racing as he tried to process everything he had just learned about Sarah. For over 2 years, they had worked side by side through countless emergencies, and he had always admired her exceptional composure under pressure. Now suddenly, he understood why she possessed skills that seemed almost supernatural in high-stress situations. "Sarah," he said gently, "would you like to talk somewhere more private?" Sarah nodded, grateful for his consideration. They walked together to his office, a small space filled with medical journals and family photos that had become familiar to her during their professional relationship. As they settled into chairs across from his desk, Sarah felt the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. Dr. Williams leaned forward, his expression thoughtful and concerned. "I have to ask why you never mentioned your military background. Your skills in trauma situations are extraordinary, and now I understand why." Sarah had dreaded this moment for 3 years. She had known that eventually someone would discover her secret, but she had hoped it would happen on her terms rather than in such a public way. The truth was complex and painful, involving decisions that had shaped every aspect of her civilian life. "Dr. Williams," she began slowly, "my military service ended in a way that made it difficult for me to talk about. I wasn't ready to answer the questions that people always ask when they find out about my background." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and trying to find words that would help him understand without revealing more than she was comfortable sharing. The memories of her final deployment were still raw, despite the years that had passed since she had returned home. "When I came back from Afghanistan, I was dealing with injuries and experiences that I wasn't ready to discuss with people who had never been in similar situations. It seemed easier to start fresh, to be just another nurse rather than someone who carried all that baggage." Dr. Williams listened intently, beginning to understand the complexity of her situation. He had worked with other veterans over the years, and he had seen how difficult the transition to civilian life could be for people who had served in combat situations. "The comments about your tattoo must have been particularly difficult," he said with genuine sympathy. Sarah's composure finally began to crack slightly. "It was hard sometimes, yes, but I had convinced myself that it didn't matter what people thought. I was focused on doing my job and helping patients. Their opinions about my tattoo seemed irrelevant compared to that. But it did matter," Dr. Williams observed gently. "I can see that it affected you more than you're willing to admit." The insight was more perceptive than Sarah had expected. Dr. Williams had always been an observant physician, skilled at reading between the lines with both patients and colleagues. Now, he was applying that same attention to detail to understanding her emotional state. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "It did matter. Every time someone made a joke about my fake military tattoo, it felt like they were dismissing the most important thing I had ever done. But I couldn't figure out how to correct them without opening up conversations I wasn't ready to have." Dr. Williams nodded understandingly. "And now that conversation has been forced on you in a very public way." "Exactly," Sarah said, feeling relief at finally being able to discuss the situation with someone who seemed to understand its complexity. "Commander Richardson meant well, and I respect his desire to honor military service. But now everyone knows, and I'm going to have to deal with all the questions and assumptions that I've been avoiding." The irony of the situation was not lost on either of them. Sarah had spent years hiding her military background to avoid unwanted attention, and now she was facing exactly the situation she had tried to prevent. The difference was that the revelation had come from a source that carried undeniable authority and credibility. "What kind of questions are you worried about?" Dr. Williams asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. Over the years, she had encountered many different reactions when people learned about her military service. Some were genuinely interested and respectful, but others asked questions that were difficult or inappropriate. "People always want to know if I killed anyone," she said bluntly. "They ask about the worst things I've seen, about whether I have PTSD, about whether the military changed me. They want dramatic stories about combat, but they're not prepared to hear the real answers to those questions." Dr. Williams winced slightly, understanding immediately why such questions would be problematic. As a physician, he had learned to recognize the signs of trauma and the importance of allowing people to share their experiences on their own terms. "And then there are the people who become uncomfortable around me once they know," Sarah continued. They start treating me differently, like I'm some kind of dangerous person or like I might have a breakdown at any moment. It changes the dynamic of relationships in ways that I'm not comfortable with. Is that why you were reluctant to discuss your background with me specifically? Dr. Williams asked. Sarah hesitated before answering. The truth was that she had considered telling Dr. Williams about her military service on several occasions, particularly when they had worked together on difficult cases where her combat experience had been relevant. However, she had always pulled back, unwilling to risk changing their professional relationship. Partly, she said honestly, I value our working relationship, and I was afraid that knowing about my background might change how you see me or how we interact professionally. Dr. Williams leaned back in his chair, processing this information. Sarah, I want you to know that learning about your military service only increases my respect for you. It explains things about your abilities that I had wondered about, but it doesn't change my opinion of who you are as a person or as a medical professional. The reassurance was exactly what Sarah had hoped to hear, but she was still concerned about how her revelation would affect her relationships with other colleagues. The conversation with Commander Richardson had been witnessed by dozens of hospital staff members, and word would spread quickly throughout the facility. I'm worried about how this will change things with the other nurses, she admitted. Some of them have made pretty hurtful comments about my tattoo over the years. Now, they know the truth, and I'm not sure how to handle that situation. Dr. Williams considered this concern carefully. He had witnessed some of the comments about Sarah's tattoo, and he had always been uncomfortable with the assumptions and jokes that some staff members had made. Now that he understood the reality of the situation, he felt a responsibility to address it appropriately. I think most of them will be embarrassed about their previous comments, he said. And hopefully, they'll learn something from this experience about making assumptions regarding things they don't understand. Maybe, Sarah said, though she sounded skeptical. But I'm also worried that some people will start treating me like some kind of curiosity or war hero. I don't want to become the subject of endless questions about my military service. The concern was legitimate, and Dr. Williams recognized that Sarah would need support as she navigated this new reality. Her desire for privacy had been violated in a very public way, and she would need time to adjust to the changed dynamics of her workplace relationships. Would it help if I spoke with the nursing staff? He offered. I could emphasize the importance of respecting your privacy while also ensuring that people understand the significance of your service. Sarah considered the offer carefully. Part of her wanted to handle the situation herself, but she also recognized that having an ally with Dr. Williams's authority and respect could be helpful in managing the fallout from the day's revelations. That might be helpful, she said eventually. I just want to be able to do my job without constantly having to discuss my military background or answer questions about my experiences. Dr. Williams nodded. I understand completely. Your military service is part of your background, but it doesn't define your entire identity or your value as a nurse. The statement struck Sarah as particularly insightful. For years, she had struggled with the balance between honoring her military service and moving forward with her civilian life. She was proud of what she had accomplished as a soldier, but she also wanted to be seen as more than just a veteran. Exactly, she said, feeling grateful that Dr. Williams seemed to understand the nuances of her situation. I'm proud of my military service, but I'm also proud of the work I've done here as a nurse. I don't want either aspect of my life to overshadow the other. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the office door. Dr. Williams called for the person to enter, and one of the senior nurses, Margaret Collins, appeared in the doorway. Margaret had been at St. Mary's for over 15 years and was respected by both staff and administration for her professionalism and leadership. I'm sorry to interrupt, Margaret said, but I wanted to speak with Sarah if she has a moment. Sarah tensed slightly, unsure of what to expect from this interaction. Margaret had never been one of the nurses who had made comments about her tattoo, but she had also never shown particular interest in developing a personal relationship with Sarah. Of course, Dr. Williams said, standing up. I'll give you two some privacy. As Dr. Williams left the office, Margaret took his place in the chair across from Sarah. Her expression was serious, but not unfriendly, and Sarah found herself waiting nervously for whatever Margaret wanted to discuss. Sarah, Margaret began, I wanted to apologize on behalf of some of our staff members for the comments that have been made about your tattoo over the years. I had no idea about your military background, but that's no excuse for the disrespect you've had to endure. The apology was unexpected and more genuine than Sarah had hoped for. Margaret's tone was sincere, and Her words seemed to come from a place of genuine regret rather than mere politeness. "Thank you, Margaret," Sarah said quietly. "I appreciate that." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more intense. "I also wanted you to know that what Commander Richardson said today has made me look at you in a completely different light. I've always respected your skills as a nurse, but now I understand that you bring experiences and abilities to this job that most of us could never match." The comment was gratifying, but Sarah was also concerned about the implications. She didn't want her military background to become the primary way that people defined her professional identity. "I hope that people will continue to judge me based on my work as a nurse rather than my military service," she said carefully. Margaret nodded understandingly. "Of course, but I also think it's important for people to understand the depth of experience you bring to difficult situations. The way you handle emergencies, the calm you maintain under pressure, the quick decisions you make. Now I understand why you're so exceptional at those things." The observation was accurate, and Sarah had to admit that her military training had given her advantages in her nursing career that she had not fully acknowledged even to herself. The ability to function under extreme stress, to make quick decisions with limited information, and to maintain emotional control in life and death situations had all been refined during her years of military service. "My military experience has definitely influenced my approach to nursing," she admitted. "But I've also learned a lot from my colleagues here, including you." Margaret smiled, clearly pleased by the acknowledgement. "I was wondering if you might be willing to share some of your experience with our newer nurses. Not necessarily the personal details of your military service, but maybe some of the skills and techniques you learned that could help them handle difficult situations more effectively." The suggestion was intriguing, and Sarah found herself considering it seriously. She had always been reluctant to draw attention to her military background, but perhaps there was value in sharing some of the practical skills she had learned with colleagues who could benefit from that knowledge. "I might be open to that," she said thoughtfully, "as long as the focus remains on practical skills rather than war stories." Margaret's expression brightened. "Absolutely. I'm thinking more about things like stress management, decision-making under pressure, team coordination during emergencies, practical skills that could make all of us better at our jobs." The conversation was revealing new possibilities that Sarah had never considered. Perhaps her military experience could be a resource for her colleagues rather than just a source of unwanted attention and uncomfortable questions. As Margaret prepared to leave, she turned back with one final comment. "Sarah, I want you to know that your service to our country is deeply appreciated, but more importantly, your continued service to our patients and our community is valued every day." After Margaret left, Sarah sat alone in Dr. Williams's office, contemplating how dramatically her life had changed in the course of a single afternoon. The secret she had guarded so carefully had been revealed, but perhaps the consequences would not be as negative as she had feared. Instead of judgment and unwanted attention, she was beginning to encounter respect and genuine appreciation for both her military service and her civilian contributions. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life at St. Mary's Hospital underwent a transformation that was both gradual and profound. The revelation of her military service had created ripples throughout the medical facility, affecting relationships and perceptions in ways that she was still learning to navigate. Each day brought new interactions and conversations that forced her to confront the reality of her changed circumstances. The most immediate difference was in how her colleagues approached her. The whispered comments about her tattoo had stopped entirely, replaced by a respectful curiosity that some people struggled to express appropriately. Sarah found herself fielding questions ranging from thoughtful inquiries about military medical training to awkward attempts at expressing gratitude for her service. Dr. Williams had kept his promise to speak with the nursing staff, addressing the situation during a departmental meeting that Sarah had chosen not to attend. According to Margaret Collins, who had become an unexpected ally, he had emphasized the importance of respecting Sarah's privacy while also helping people understand the significance of her military background. The message seemed to have been received, as the more intrusive questions had diminished significantly. However, not all of the changes were comfortable for Sarah. Some colleagues had begun treating her with a deference that felt awkward and unnecessary. They would defer to her judgment in situations where her military experience was irrelevant, or they would become overly solicitous about her comfort and well-being. While she appreciated their good intentions, this special treatment made her feel isolated in new ways. One particular incident stood out as emblematic of these challenges. During a routine staff meeting about new protocols for emergency procedures, Sarah had offered a suggestion based on her understanding of triage principles learned in combat situations. Rather than evaluating her idea on its merits, several colleagues had immediately endorsed it simply because it came from her military experience. The automatic acceptance felt almost as dismissive as the previous mockery had been. Sarah was struggling with the realization that she had traded one form of misunderstanding for another. Instead of being dismissed as someone with a fake military tattoo, she was now being elevated to a pedestal that felt equally uncomfortable. People seemed unable to find a middle ground where they could acknowledge her military service without making it the defining characteristic of every interaction. The situation became more complex when word of the incident began to spread beyond the hospital. Commander Richardson had filed a report about encountering Sarah, and through military networks, news of the decorated combat medic working as a civilian nurse had reached other veterans and military personnel in the area. Sarah began receiving unexpected visitors and phone calls from people who wanted to connect with her based on their shared military experience. Most of these contacts were well-intentioned, but they created additional pressure for Sarah to become more publicly involved in veteran affairs and military support activities. She received invitations to speak at veteran events, requests for interviews from local media outlets, and offers to participate in programs designed to help other veterans transition to civilian careers. While Sarah was touched by the recognition and the desire to include her in the veteran community, she remained reluctant to take on a public role. Her healing process was still ongoing, and she was not ready to become a spokesperson for military service or veteran issues. The attention felt overwhelming and intrusive, threatening the quiet stability she had worked so hard to establish. The most challenging moment came when she received a phone call from the family of one of her former teammates who had been killed in the same explosion that had ended her military career. They had learned about her location through military channels and wanted to meet with her to discuss their son's final deployment. The conversation was emotionally devastating for Sarah, bringing back memories and feelings that she had spent years trying to process. After hanging up the phone, Sarah found herself sitting in her car in a hospital parking lot, overwhelmed by emotions that threatened to destroy the careful equilibrium she had maintained. The past and present were colliding in ways that made it difficult for her to function, and she began to question whether the revelation of her military service had been worth the consequences it was creating. It was Margaret Collins who found her in the parking lot and recognized that she was in distress. Without asking questions or making assumptions, Margaret simply sat with her until Sarah was ready to talk. When the words finally came, they brought with them years of suppressed grief and trauma that Sarah had never fully shared with anyone. "I've been trying so hard to move forward," Sarah said through tears that she had held back for too long. "I thought that if I could just focus on being a good nurse, I could leave the war behind. But it's always there, and now everyone knows about it." Margaret listened without judgment, understanding instinctively that Sarah needed someone to hear her struggles without trying to fix them or offer solutions. Sometimes the most helpful thing was simply to witness someone's pain and validate their experience. "You don't have to carry this alone," Margaret said gently, "and you don't have to be anything other than who you are. Your military service is part of your story, but it doesn't have to define every chapter of your life." The conversation was a turning point for Sarah, helping her realize that she had been approaching the situation from an all-or-nothing perspective. She had believed that she either had to hide her military service completely or allow it to become the primary focus of her identity. Margaret helped her see that there might be a third option, integrating her military experience into her civilian life in a way that honored both aspects of her identity. Over the following days, Sarah began to make more intentional choices about how to handle the attention and opportunities that had resulted from the revelation of her military service. She declined most of the speaking engagements and media requests, but she agreed to participate in a mentoring program for veterans who were transitioning to healthcare careers. The program allowed her to share her experience in a structured way while maintaining appropriate boundaries. She also began working with Dr. Williams and Margaret to develop training sessions for hospital staff on trauma care techniques that drew from military medical protocols. Rather than focusing on her personal combat experiences, these sessions emphasized practical skills and approaches that could benefit patient care. The initiative was well received, and gave Sarah a way to contribute her military knowledge without having to discuss the personal aspects of her service. Most importantly, Sarah began seeing a counselor who specialized in working with veterans. She had resisted this step for years, convinced that she could handle her emotional healing on her own. However, the recent events had made it clear that professional support would be helpful in processing her experiences and finding healthy ways to integrate her military service with her civilian life. The counseling sessions were challenging, but ultimately liberating. For the first time since her return from Afghanistan, Sarah was able to discuss her experiences with someone who understood the complexity of military service and the difficulties of transition. She learned coping strategies for managing the memories and emotions that sometimes overwhelmed her, and she began to develop a more balanced perspective on her identity as both a veteran and a civilian. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Sarah realized that her desire to help others through nursing was directly connected to her military service, rather than being separate from it. Her drive to save lives and provide care in crisis situations have been shaped by her combat experiences, and her exceptional skills as a trauma nurse were a direct result of the training and experience she had gained in the military. This understanding allowed her to see her military service and her nursing career as part of a continuous commitment to service rather than as competing aspects of her identity. She was not a veteran who happened to be a nurse, or a nurse who happened to be a veteran. She was someone who had chosen to dedicate her life to helping others, and both her military service and her healthcare career were expressions of that fundamental commitment. The shift in perspective was reflected in how Sarah began to interact with her colleagues and respond to questions about her background. Instead of deflecting inquiries about her military service, she started sharing appropriate details that helped people understand how her experiences had shaped her approach to patient care. Rather than treating her military background as a secret to be hidden or a qualification to be flaunted, she began presenting it as one element of her professional development. The change was noticed by everyone who worked with her. Dr. Williams commented that Sarah seemed more confident and comfortable in her role, and that her willingness to share her expertise was benefiting the entire department. Margaret observed that the integration of Sarah's military experience into training programs was improving the overall quality of emergency care at the hospital. Most significantly, Sarah herself began to feel a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. She was no longer carrying the burden of a hidden identity, but she was also not allowing her military service to overshadow her civilian achievements. The balance she had been seeking was finally within reach, though she recognized that maintaining it would require ongoing effort and awareness. The transformation was not complete, and Sarah knew that she would continue to face challenges as she navigated the intersection of her military and civilian identities. However, she was now approaching these challenges with tools and support systems that made them feel manageable rather than overwhelming. As she reflected on the events that had led to this point, Sarah realized that Commander Richardson's intervention, though initially unwelcome, had ultimately forced her to confront issues that she had been avoiding. The public revelation of her military service had created difficulties, but it had also opened doors to healing and growth that might not have been possible if she had continued to hide her past. The tattoo on her arm no longer felt like a burden to be concealed or explained. It had become what it was always meant to be, a symbol of pride, sacrifice, and service that was part of her story, but not the entire narrative of her life. The insignia represented her past, but it also connected to her present and future as someone committed to helping others in whatever capacity was needed. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood before a group of newly graduated nurses during their orientation at St. Mary's Hospital. The conference room was filled with young faces, eager and nervous about beginning their careers in healthcare. As she prepared to speak about emergency protocols and trauma care, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that unexpected encounter with Commander Richardson. The tattoo on her left arm was visible as she gestured, but now it represented something different than it had during those difficult years when she had hidden her military service. It was no longer a source of shame or secrecy, nor was it a credential that overshadowed her civilian accomplishments. It had become what it was always meant to be, one part of a complex story that included service, sacrifice, healing, and growth. Today we're going to discuss trauma care protocols, Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence that had developed over months of learning to integrate her military and civilian identities. I want to share some techniques that I learned during my military service that have proven invaluable in civilian emergency medicine. The new nurses listened intently, some taking notes while others leaned forward with obvious interest. Unlike her colleagues who had discovered her background through the dramatic revelations 6 months earlier, these nurses were learning about her military service in a professional context where it was directly relevant to their education. The most important thing I learned in combat medicine is that chaos is the default state of emergency situations, Sarah continued. Your job is not to eliminate the chaos, but to function effectively within it. This means developing systems and protocols that work even when conditions are far from ideal. As she spoke, Sarah drew on years of experience that spanned both military and civilian healthcare. The techniques she described had been refined through countless emergency situations, from battlefield injuries to hospital trauma cases. Her teaching style was practical and direct, focusing on skills that could save lives rather than dramatic stories about combat. Dr. Williams watched from the back of the room, noting how naturally Sarah had grown into her role as a mentor and educator. The transformation had been gradual, but remarkable. The quiet, guarded nurse who had once deflected all questions about her background had become one of their most effective teachers and leaders. After the training session, several of the new nurses approached Sarah with questions about her military service. Their inquiries were different from the awkward conversations she had endured in the months following her public revelation. These young professionals were interested in learning from her experience rather than satisfying their curiosity about military life. How do you manage the emotional stress of emergency situations? One nurse asked. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed during difficult cases. Sarah considered the question carefully, drawing on both her military training and the counseling she had received to develop her response. The key is recognizing that feeling overwhelmed is normal and doesn't mean you're not capable of doing your job, she said. In the military, we learn to compartmentalize during emergencies and process emotions afterward. That skill translates directly to civilian medicine. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Sarah sharing practical strategies for stress management, decision-making under pressure, and maintaining emotional resilience in difficult situations. She was careful to focus on skills and techniques rather than personal anecdotes, maintaining appropriate professional boundaries while still providing valuable guidance. As the group dispersed, Margaret Collins approached with a smile that reflected her satisfaction with how the session had gone. "You're a natural teacher," she observed. "Have you considered pursuing a formal education role?" The suggestion was not entirely unexpected. Over the past several months, Sarah had received similar encouragement from various colleagues who had observed her teaching abilities. The idea of transitioning into a more formal educational role was appealing, but it also represented a significant change from the quiet anonymity she had once sought. "I've been thinking about it," Sarah admitted, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of visibility and responsibility." Margaret's expression was understanding, but encouraging. "You don't have to decide immediately, but I think you should know that you've made a significant impact on our department's training programs. The emergency response protocols you've helped develop have already improved patient outcomes." The comment was gratifying and reflected the positive changes that had resulted from Sarah's decision to share her expertise more openly. The training programs she had helped create have been adopted by other departments within the hospital, and there have been discussions about sharing them with other medical facilities in the region. Later that afternoon, Sarah received a phone call that would further challenge her comfort zone. The caller identified herself as Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Veterans Administration Medical Center, and she had a proposal that was both intriguing and intimidating. "Ms. Martinez," Dr. Walsh said, "I've been hearing excellent things about the training programs you've developed at St. Mary's. We're looking for someone to lead a new initiative focused on helping military medics transition to civilian healthcare careers, and your background makes you an ideal candidate." The opportunity was exactly the kind of high-profile position that Sarah had been avoiding, but it was also closely aligned with her growing interest in helping other veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life. The position would involve developing curriculum, training instructors, and working directly with veterans who were pursuing healthcare careers. "I'm flattered by the offer," Sarah replied carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person for such a visible role." Dr. Walsh's response indicated that she had anticipated this reluctance. "I understand your hesitation, but I think you underestimate how much your experience could help other veterans. The challenges you've faced and overcome are exactly what make you qualified to guide others through similar transitions. The conversation lasted for nearly an hour, with Dr. Walsh describing the program in detail and addressing many of Sarah's concerns about taking on such a prominent position. The opportunity was compelling, but it would require Sarah to step further into the public eye than she had ever been comfortable with. After ending the call, Sarah found herself sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot, just as she had 6 months earlier when the weight of her revealed military service had felt overwhelming. This time, however, the emotions were different. Instead of feeling trapped by circumstances beyond her control, she was facing a choice that could significantly impact her future. The parking lot held different memories now. It was where Margaret had found her in distress and helped her begin to process the integration of her military and civilian identities. It was where she had made phone calls to schedule her first counseling appointment. It was where she had practiced the speech she would give to address her department about how she wanted her military service to be discussed and understood. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unexpected source. Commander Richardson had stayed in touch occasionally since their encounter at the hospital, usually sending brief messages to check on her well-being. This message was different, though. It contained a link to a news article about the VA program that Dr. Walsh had described, along with a simple note. "This sounds like something you were meant to do." The article provided more details about the initiative and quoted several veterans who had struggled with the transition to civilian healthcare careers. Their stories were painfully familiar to Sarah, reflecting challenges she had faced and emotions she had experienced during her own difficult adjustment period. Reading their accounts made her realize how much her own journey could benefit others who were facing similar obstacles. That evening, Sarah called her counselor to discuss the opportunity and her conflicted feelings about it. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, no relation, had been instrumental in helping Sarah process her military experiences and develop strategies for integrating her veteran identity with her civilian life. "What scares you most about this opportunity?" Dr. Martinez asked during their phone conversation. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I'm afraid that taking on a public role like this will define me entirely by my military service. I've worked so hard to find a balance between honoring my past and building a civilian future." "And what attracts you to the opportunity?" The answer came more easily. "The chance to help other veterans avoid some of the mistakes I made during my own transition. I spent too many years hiding from my military experience instead of finding healthy ways to integrate it into my civilian life." Dr. Martinez's response was characteristically insightful. "It sounds like this position could allow you to use your military experience in service of others, which seems consistent with your core values of helping people." The observation resonated deeply with Sarah. Throughout her life, both military and civilian, her primary motivation had been the desire to help others. Her military service had been about protecting and saving lives. Her nursing career had been about healing and providing care. This new opportunity would be about helping veterans navigate challenges that she understood intimately. Over the following week, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about the VA position and what it might mean for her future. She discussed it with Dr. Williams, who was supportive but sad at the prospect of losing such a valuable team member. She talked with Margaret, who encouraged her to consider the broader impacts she could have. She even reached out to a few veteran friends to get their perspectives on the program. The deciding factor came when she received a call from a young veteran named Marcus Thompson, who had been given her contact information by someone at the VA. Marcus was struggling with the transition from military to civilian life and was considering a career in healthcare, but feeling overwhelmed by the challenges involved. "I heard that you made the transition from combat medic to civilian nurse," Marcus said during their phone conversation. "I'm hoping you might have some advice for someone who's just starting that journey." The conversation lasted for over an hour, with Sarah sharing strategies and insights that she had learned through her own difficult transition. She found herself drawing on lessons from her military service, her civilian nursing experience, and her counseling sessions to provide guidance that was both practical and emotionally supportive. After ending the call with Marcus, Sarah realized that the conversation had given her a preview of what the VA position might involve. She had felt energized and purposeful while helping Marcus, and she could envision how that type of interaction could be expanded into a comprehensive program that could help dozens or even hundreds of veterans. The next morning, Sarah called Dr. Walsh to accept the position, with the caveat that she would need to complete her commitments at St. Mary's before beginning her new role. The transition would take several months, giving her time to finish ongoing projects and ensure that her replacement would be properly trained. The announcement of her new position was met with mixed reactions at the hospital. Many colleagues expressed pride in her achievement and support for her decision, while others were disappointed to see her leave. Dr. Williams organized a department meeting to discuss her transition and to ensure that the training programs she had developed would continue in her absence. "Sarah has transformed our approach to emergency care," Dr. Williams said during the meeting. "Her willingness to share her military experience has made all of us better at our jobs, and her legacy here will continue long after she moves on to her new role." The recognition was gratifying, but what meant the most to Sarah was the knowledge that she had found a way to honor her military service while building a meaningful civilian career. The tattoo on her arm no longer represented a burden to be hidden or a qualification to be flaunted. It had become a symbol of service that connected her past, present, and future in a way that felt authentic and purposeful. As Sarah prepared for her transition to the VA position, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The unexpected encounter with Commander Richardson had initially felt like a violation of her privacy and a disruption of the quiet life she had built. However, it had ultimately led to healing, growth, and opportunities that she could never have imagined. The young woman who had once hidden her military service out of fear and pain had become someone who could use that experience to help others navigate similar challenges. The combat medic who had saved lives on a battlefield had become a nurse who saved lives in civilian hospitals, and now she would become an educator who could help other veterans find their own paths to meaningful civilian careers. The insignia on her arm would always carry the weight of sacrifice and service, but it no longer felt like a burden. It had become what it was meant to be, a symbol of dedication to helping others, regardless of the setting or circumstances. Sarah Martinez had learned to honor her past while embracing her future, and in doing so, she had found a way to serve that transcended the boundaries between military and civilian life.